Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for this panel late in the afternoon on the best ecosystems in the world. I am thrilled to invite to the stage four incredible panelists with amazing backgrounds. Our first panelist is the founder of Startup Malaysia, the founder and director of the Founders Institute, and has spoken already at probably 10,000 events like this. I'd like to welcome to the stage Dash. Our next panelist might look familiar to some of you because he's recently been traveling all around the world and was in France just last year as part of his World Startup Report, which has taken him to pretty much every corner of the globe. And he has recently launched the World Startup Wiki, which is helping to gather information on startup ecosystems globally. Please welcome Bowei Gai. Our next panelist is the president of the European Young Entrepreneurs Association. He is the founder and head and chairman of the Hellenic Startup Association and also represents young entrepreneurs at the G20. Dmitris Tsigos, welcome. And our last panelist comes to us with a deep international career in politics and in public policy in technology and startups. Jon Steinberg began his career in US working on presidential campaigns and is now working as the head of external affairs for Google Europe. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Steinberg. Jon? So thank you again to all of the members of the panel. I'm really thrilled that you could all be here with us. And I'm also especially happy because we have someone from pretty much every corner of the world that can talk to us about each of these best ecosystems in the world. I'm going to go ahead and start with Bowei because you have traveled to pretty much all of these places. Could you tell us, of all of the countries you visited, what country do you think had the most developed startup ecosystem and why?
So the development of the startup ecosystem nowadays is very much intertwined with the GDP of a country. So if you take a look at the top 10 countries by GDP, pretty much all of them, the US, China, Japan, France, UK, they all have very developed startup ecosystem. That's not a surprise anymore. What is a surprise is two categories of startup ecosystem. Number one is the type of ecosystem that's driven by the government due to good government policy, that they're able to create a very mature ecosystem. Those include Israel, Malaysia, and Singapore. And the other side of the equation, which is the startup ecosystem that's driven by surprise successes. So these are the countries like Finland, Estonia, and these are and a few other ones.
Great. And Dmitris, since you are representing the Young Entrepreneurs Association of Europe, what do you think makes a good startup ecosystem? And could you tell us an example perhaps of one here in Europe?
Yes, many thanks. So first of all, in my opinion, a good startup ecosystem basically combines two cultures, the culture of collaboration and the culture of failure. So having very much developed culture of collaboration and culture of failure defines a good ecosystem. So now talking about Europe and also the rest of the world, in my humble opinion, we cannot talk about country ecosystems. So we cannot talk about the French or the German startup ecosystem, but it would be more wise to focus to the city level. So in terms of cities, in Europe, obviously Paris, Berlin, and London are the champions, and each of us can argue which is better. A city can be better in one aspect, another in, I don't think it's easy to pick one of those three. But it's very impressive, and I would like to conclude with this, that in the most badly hit areas by the economic crisis in Europe, like Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, we can see a strong growing ecosystem, and that fills me with optimism.
Great. And Dash, you come to us with experience on building your own system that's really grown the ecosystem in Malaysia. Could you talk about the before and after?
Yeah. Firstly, it's a great pleasure to be in a country that invented the word entrepreneur. So it's interesting. Yeah. And about my experience with Malaysia, number one, when I started promoting or evangelizing startups way back in 2008, there were very few technology companies that were already there, like Catcha Group was already there, MOL, Malaysian Online was present, Job Street was present, but they were far in between. And going around the country, educating young people about building startups, and they're not knowing the difference between a startup and an SME was very interesting. And that wave was, that gathered momentum very, very rapidly, and more young people started getting involved in startups. The interesting thing, as Bowei mentioned, was the Malaysian government has always been very interested and encouraging towards building tech startups. I mean, from way back 15 years ago in 2000, we already have set up a seed fund by the government. So in my experience, the government plus private sector has been working together to build a startup. But the private sector is not really coming forward yet.
And Jon, in your role at Google, you deal on a regular basis with startups not only in Europe, but as well in the Middle East and Asia. Could you share your thoughts on the contrasting environments in each of those regions with regards to the startup ecosystem?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is what these guys have already said. I mean, we see different cultures of risk-taking and tolerance of failure. So I can remember being at an event in Korea, and there was a real concern that young people aren't encouraged to take risks. The sort of model careers to join the civil service, and that's still seen as success. So in some cultures, I think there's a lot of work to be done to show role models of success, to show different paths. And as well, you see some differences in the kinds of companies. So, I think in Europe, the specializations have become a little less relevant. I think in London, you see a lot of fintech still because of the London as a financial center. But here in Paris, there's a lot of startups in that space. I think in Africa, there's maybe a bit more of the B2C. Consumer apps is sort of the early start of that scene, and then it grows wider as people find success and start to see different things happening. But I think the more I travel, the more I see these similarities. People excited about the opportunities, people excited about what technology is enabling them to do, what these platforms are enabling them to do. And so it's, everywhere we go, we're excited about what's happening on the ground.
So moving forward, we've kind of discussed a little bit about what you all believe are the necessary elements to create the best possible ecosystem. We did get a question on Assembly from someone in our audience, and if maybe each of you could take just a minute to respond to it. I know each of you have touched on it as well, but I want to make sure we're also engaging with the audience. What's your definition in 30 seconds or maybe a minute of a good ecosystem? What defines a good ecosystem is the question.
Well, I'll start. I think a good ecosystem is about a couple of different things. It's about density of network, it's about talent, it's about a culture of entrepreneurship, people willing to take risks. I think it's also about capital. And so if you can get those four main categories right and have government in a lot of ways get out of the way to allow the ecosystem and the private sector to do what it can do, then I think that's a recipe for success.
Very briefly, a good ecosystem basically has culture of collaboration, culture of failure, and tons of positive energy.
Great. Bowei?
I think they have covered everything already. But aside from that, I would say like a good ecosystem also has something to do with opportunities. I think you can have the best ecosystem, but if you have no opportunities within the country, that's hard. Like either you have a local market or you find a way to tap into the global market. So opportunity also is very, very important.
Yeah, I think one of the key things in a good ecosystem is trust. I think ecosystem players need to build trust among each other. And it's very easy for an ecosystem to become very quickly fragmented because everyone thinks they are doing the right thing and the other one is not doing the right thing. So the most important is to build trust and come together and collaborate. And that's to me, is very crucial.
Great. And I think, Bowei, you just touched on this a little bit about opportunities and responding to challenges. And so, Dmitris, I wanted to start by asking you, but I'm going to spend some time kind of addressing what challenges ecosystems face. But Dmitris, what do you think is the biggest challenge for a startup navigating government in Europe, for example?
Well, I can hardly imagine any bigger challenge. Look, governments and startups are two completely different worlds, and there is nothing wrong with that. So, as we said before, culture of collaboration is very important. So, instead of startup entrepreneurs, including myself, we have a natural tendency to complaining. We must overcome this and try to become a little bit more constructive and actually talk to the government, try to understand them, and expect from the government to have a similar behavior. I think we have good news in the European level. Personally, I'm impressed by the progress in the EU space about their intention to communicate with startup entrepreneurs, and we've seen some amazing progress there. So you need open mind to navigate with governments, constructive approach, and ready to discuss with somebody completely different than you.
Jon, can you share a specific example of a policy issue that's been problematic in your experience assisting EMEA countries?
Sure. I think one of the issues that we see a lot across different markets is regulation on capital. So I know in France there's been some loosening of the rules around crowdfunding. So I think what we find a lot with government is they're, building on what you said, they're very supportive of entrepreneurs. They may not really understand the role that startups are having in their economy because there's a lack of data. And so one of the things that we try to do at Google is to bring that evidence to bear to help build arguments on support of startups. But I think also they want to know exactly what they can do. So if you can work with the government and say, these are the 5 things that would really make a difference in our market, then it gives them an agenda to go work on, rather than, they may do something on tax that is really not helpful to entrepreneurs because they don't understand the issues. Or they might do something on a data regulation or a privacy regulation. And a lot of startups aren't in a space yet where they need to fight those issues. But in the UK, we've seen a lot of progress with government by being very specific with the asks. So I think that's the key learning.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? What do you think is then the biggest hurdle that startups can, jump over through policy reform and with the help of government?
The biggest hurdle, what's the biggest issue they can jump over? I think we can do anything as long as we put a strong argument together. I think when you look across Europe specifically, there are some real looming issues. So around data localization is going to be something that I think a lot of startups perhaps don't know how it's going to affect them, but they may find that it will and be quite a serious issue for them. And I think that's something that the community should rally around.
Dmitris, you look like you
I'd like to say something here. I think it's very important. I'd like to point out the super significant importance of education, especially for Europe. Because looking at the European startup ecosystem, we see an insane phenomenon. We're having amazingly high level of talent, but we don't, in engineering, for instance, but we don't see similar successful startups. And I think that has to do with education, and only if startups successfully work together with governments, they can really tackle this issue. So that's of extremely high importance to change the educational mentality in Europe.
Dash, I would go to you after this question because you've worked directly with going into secondary schools and trying to educate people on the importance of entrepreneurship and programs that teach coding, et cetera. So what do you think government can do differently to help in some of the ways that your association have, maybe with education, but also with other measures?
So maybe I'll give a more elaborate answer to that in an indirect way. I think one thing that I believe in is that every young person needs to be taught 2 key skills One is that every problem is an opportunity. The bigger the problem, the bigger the opportunity. The second is that you can do a lot with a lot less. Constraints spur creativity. And this is the two things that we actually instill in our programs in schools or in colleges. And with that, we say to the young people that you should churn out a lot of test ventures. You should play with the idea of solving small problems. It's how you create footballers. You know, if you go to the beach in Rio or Sao Paulo, you could see a lot of young people playing football. And the same way, you need to get a lot of young people play with creating ventures, failing, breaking things, and then coming out. The way the government could help is, I mean, if any of you have read the book David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell, he says everything is an inverted U-curve. You could actually parent a child up to a point. After that, over-parenting has a negative effect. And government's role is the same. Government should get involved up to a point, and beyond the point, becomes counterproductive. What I think now a government like Malaysian government could do is they are really interested in the entrepreneurship, they are really pushing hard, what have you. I would think the next step is to say, let's launch the corporate entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship program where private sectors can play a role in promoting these events and hackathons and programs where they get a tax break, whereas the government's role is now to select the top entrepreneurs from those pool and back them all the way to become winners. That's what I think the next role should be.
And I want to address this question to each of you to get your perspective on it, because many of the people in the audience here are from all over the world. What do you think are the largest challenges that startups face at an international level in coming together on some of these issues?
So as I travel around the world to 29 countries last year, I did notice that almost all startup ecosystem face the same set of issues. But that's also not correct, because they face the same issues at different stages of the startup ecosystem life. For example, in France right now, I hear a lot of chatter about stock option for the employees. That's something that's not known, and then some of the taxation issues in this country. But if you go into US, which is a lot more developed ecosystem, people don't really care about the stock option anymore. The tax is pretty well defined. They care more about how to get more people, more immigrants into the country, more the technical people from around the world so they can have more labor. So immigration is on their mind, and also things like privacy. But if you take a step all the way back into places like Africa, and where I am right now in the Philippines, they are worrying about completely different set of issues, which is, how do we get the basic infrastructure so we can even build a company? For example, the place where I'm right now, if you want to get internet, it can cost you as much as $600 for 1 megabit of internet. $600. So if you just think about these, people face the same issue, but they face it at a different time. So the challenge for putting everyone together is, how do you guys figure out a common cause across all the startup ecosystem? So that's a challenge, I think, in my opinion.
Does anyone else want to respond, or go ahead?
So if we think of the diversity of the different startup communities in terms of risk capital available, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, we'll see that the diversity is just crazy. It's very big. Also, we have, the maturity stage, as you just said, is completely different. So, in my humble opinion, in order to really try to unite the various startup communities, we must focus very much on the fundamentals. What is really the driving force for launching a startup? What makes a person start a company and work together with somebody else to co-create? So we must find a very real, we must articulate this driving force, this vision, because this really unites us. the differences of communities are very, very big. So we must focus to the fundamentals, this driving force, which is creativity and happiness, basically, in my humble opinion. And based on this, we shall find the common denominator to work together.
So, a startup is, or entrepreneurship is a faith-based activity, right? You don't know what's going to happen. So you have an idea, you go with faith, you say, I'm going to have this idea, and it's all a series of guesses, and you may fail, right? So there's a lot of rationality, logic around it, but also there's a lot, you've got to manage your own epiphany and serendipity around this. So I think one of the biggest hurdles is for policymakers to understand there is a sense of play and a sense of high level of risk. It's art and science that comes together. So how you design the ecosystem may not be too much. It needs to have both rigor as well as an ability to let people fail, and let people be joyful in what they do, encourage younger people to be fearless in starting the startups. I think forgiving failures is one of the key things to do. Yeah.
John, did you want to respond?
I was just going to say as well that I think, the startup community and the entrepreneurship community globally has a great opportunity. When I meet with government officials, they're quite competitive, these cities. London wants to be the best in Europe. It wants to beat New York. Paris wants to be better than Berlin. Amsterdam wants to know how it gets to be part of this conversation. Stockholm equally so. So if these communities are working together, there's a real opportunity to then say, well, my colleagues in Paris tell me that government's willing to do this for them. Well, policymakers listen to those sorts of arguments. So I think in a much more kind of tactical level, there are wins to be had here.
Like Malaysia and Singapore, we don't compete. We are collaborating all the time.
Well, I think based on our discussion today, it's clear that there are a lot of ways that governments really need to begin to catch up with the fast-moving pace of startups. And there's a missing voice of startups in policy and government. And our panelists have shown really that we're all from diverse backgrounds, but there are bridges that can be built within startup communities worldwide. So that's why today we're officially launching a new association called Allied for Startups, which is an association that will use our shared experiences to build consensus on policy issues around the world. To introduce our partners, we are 16 countries, 18 associations across 4 continents. And we are all coming together because we're interested in answering the question of how can we use these shared experiences that we have to really impact the way policies are made for startups. And as many of you have mentioned in the panel as well, global consensus building is going to be a challenge. It is definitely a challenge, but we do have a plan, and it's not going to be a one-off, easy-to-solve approach. But yesterday, I had the opportunity to sit on the rooftop of Criteo with many of the members of this association who came from all over the world to talk about this vision and this need to create this new network where we can really create a way to discuss startup policy together. And we agreed that sweeping benchmarks and creating big goals that we'll never meet is not the way to do that. So the first thing that we're going to do, by starting simple and learning to understand each other's common agendas, is to begin a global inventory. So after this event, we're each going to go back to our countries and talk to the startups that are members of our associations, talk to entrepreneurs, talk to VCs, talk to investors, we can understand how many jobs are being created, what kind of impact is being made on the economy. And then that way, when we take this data and this information to places like the European Commission or the Malaysian government or the United States government, we can show them real data, much like the France Digitale barometer, that can have a real impact. And the power of data really will help us going forward, but this is just the beginning. The global inventory is only the beginning for Allied for Startups. Today we're launching with partners, as you can see on the screen, in Brazil, Chile, Denmark, the European Union, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Malaysia, Slovakia, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the US. And actually, many of our members have traveled here from all over the world to be at the Allied for Startups launch at France Digitale Day today. Many of them are sitting on the panel here. Everyone with me at the panel has been incredibly supportive in this process. Startup Malaysia is a member, the YES is a member. World Startup Report is a great counselor that has connected all of us to really begin this conversation, and Google has been very supportive. Guy Levin from the Coalition for the Digital Economy is here, but he is downstairs participating in the Investors Workshop, but I wanted to be sure to acknowledge him. And for the members of the audience who have traveled from around the world, when I say your name, if you could stand up so we can acknowledge you. Sophia from Spain Startup. Where is she? She's here somewhere. Michael McGarry from Engine Advocacy in the US is here. Nicolas Vanetis from the Hellenic Startup Association is here, who came from Greece. Veronica Pistura from Bridge Budapest. Federico from the Italia Startup is here. Pedro Rocha Vieira from Bowei in Portugal. Is he in the back? So again, thank you to all of our members who have supported us, and we're really hoping that this initiative and the global inventory will help us have an impact on startup policy worldwide.